Okay, welcome back to On the Ball, the podcast from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and today we are so fortunate to have one of my favorite narrative nonfiction authors out there, Scott Ellsworth, who is here on campus to speak at the Vanderbilt Library and is gracious enough to give us some time to come on the podcast. Scott, welcome to Nashville.
Well, thanks. It's an honor to be on the ball.
Well, we just had lunch, and you mentioned that you've been to Nashville many times over the years, and you mentioned a story about a potato chip truck that had a role in some of your first interest in Nashville that totally surprised me. So can you tell us the story of how potato chips relate to Nashville in your life?
Okay. So I grew up in, as you know, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the summer of 1972, between my senior year in high school and freshman year in college, I drove a Charles Chips potato chip truck where you'd make a step van, make home delivery to people who subscribed to their service. It didn't have air conditioning, but it also only had an AM radio. And I was into, Led Zeppelin or whatever those days. And the AM pop radio was so horrible, I started listening to the country station. And I'd grown up with, certainly country music was common in Oklahoma, but I sort of really got into it. Either the songs were really horrible and they were hilarious, or they were really good. And as a result of that, when I went off to college in Portland, Oregon, I had my own weekly old-time country music show once a week at a local public radio station in Portland. Would play Hank Williams and Hank Thompson and Bob Wills and all the old stuff. And and with that, I ended up getting to interview whenever country stars would come to town. So I got to interview Dolly Parton and George Jones and Tammy Wynette and Loretta Lynn and on and on and on. And I would pass through Nashville and go to the Ernest Tubb record store, go to shows at the Ryman, and became a great fan of Nashville as a result.
Wow, what a story! I remember Charles Chips are the ones that come in the
tins.
Tubs, right?
Yeah,
tins.
right,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you can go from a potato chip salesman to a best-selling author,
there
a
you
university
go.
professor. Who knew? So you're a professor at University of Michigan, where you teach on race and civil rights, sports history as well, right? And the first book of yours that I read was The Secret Game. And so I want to come back to that. But first I want to go back to growing up in Oklahoma.
Sure.
Were sports a part of your life as a kid, either as an athlete or following some of the legendary figures that have come out of Oklahoma?
Oh, sure. No, absolutely. Of course, I'm growing up in the 1960s and into the 1970s. We, football was big in Oklahoma, but I played Little League baseball. I played some football as well, too, and basketball. But it was, growing up certainly as, a fan of baseball. And, of course, at that time, one of the greatest baseball players was a fellow Oklahoman, which was Mickey Mantle. So when I'm playing for the Lee Generals of Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Tulsa, I, of course, picked number 7 because that was Mickey's number well, too.
It was quite a fight for that number, probably.
Absolutely. And then, in high school, my high school, Central High School, we won the state championship our junior year. Also, were like runners-up sophomore and senior year. So we had just a terrific team, and I certainly got into basketball at that point.
Okay. Was Johnny Bench a contemporary of yours, or?
No, he would have been older. And in high school, I was a swimmer. I was a swimming letterman.
Got it. Okay. Thinking about Robert E. Lee High School and the work that you've done on the Tulsa Race Massacre. That was a project that you began in college, is that right?
Yeah, so as your listeners may know, the Tulsa Race Massacre was the single worst incident of racial violence in all of American history. Over about a 12-hour period, more than 1,000 African-American homes and businesses were looted and burnt to the ground by a white mob with the help of the Tulsa police force.
But these weren't stories that you would learn about as a student at Lee Elementary School.
No, but it was stories that I would occasionally hear, even as a little kid. Would hear maybe neighbors talk about it. My family's history in Tulsa goes back to the 30s, not to 1921. So there wasn't a grandma or somebody I could ask. But I would hear stories, and I knew that there was some sort of a skeleton in my hometown's closet. And then when I became a history major at Reed College in Portland, I had to write a senior thesis, and I wrote about the massacre and then turned that into my first book.
Okay. So we share a bit in common there. When I was a sophomore here at Vanderbilt, I was taking a Black history course and wrote a paper about Perry Wallace.
I'll be darned.
And that later turned into my first book. Looking back at my paper, it wasn't that good, really, know, but it was an introduction to the subject. I had a chance to interview Perry for it, and it gave me a sense of purpose. I felt like it was the most interesting thing that I did in college, and it was 17 years later that I came back to the story to write the book that hadn't left my mind. Was that a similar experience for you?
And probably what happened to you was similar, that we share one thing is that I also did my first ever oral history interview for my senior thesis at Reed, and then did others. But I interviewed elderly African-American men and women who'd been adults at the time of the massacre, and they'd never been interviewed by anyone before. But the key for me was seeing this rich source of history, and that they shared with me information I couldn't find in any newspaper source or printed source. So that made the story very real. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then you came back to the subject again to not only look at the history, but also the way the city had dealt with that history and the search for, justice or compensation for the people that were affected.
Yeah, so I've been involved with the story, the massacre, and getting the story out now for 50 years. And when the centennial of the massacre was nearing for 2021, I hadn't really planned on writing about it, but then I realized that, because I've been involved with it so long, that I was probably one of the last people living that knew how the story had been suppressed for a half century, and then what it took for us to get the story out. And I thought that's something that should be worthwhile, should be documented, and could also help other cities and communities around the world who are trying to grapple with their own skeletons in their past. So that book was the groundbreaking that came out 4 years ago.
Have you seen your role as a mix of a historian, journalist, but also like advocate in some ways?
Oh, absolutely. No question about that. Probably in one of the most lasting ways was that during a state commission that was created in the 1990s to study the massacre, I came up with the idea that we should search for the graves, the unmarked graves of massacre victims, and we've continued that to this day. In fact, right now there is a new excavation going on at a formerly segregated cemetery in Tulsa. We have been able, through forensic genealogy and also DNA, really cutting-edge stuff, we've identified some of the remains of unidentified massacre victims. So that work is going on.
I did an article for ESPN's Undefeated, which is now called Anscape, several years ago on the Ocoee massacre.
Yeah, sure.
And it was related to, economics and suppressing Black wealth in Central Florida, but also more closely aligned with elections, and voter suppression.
Vote. Absolutely.
Right. But in just learning about that period of time in Florida and how many people were losing their farms, or, violence directed at people that were making some money, maybe like running a post office or something. I'm sure you hear about Tulsa now, thanks to you and the people you've worked with in Oklahoma, but how many of these similar stories, maybe on a smaller scale, do you think are still out there that you talk about the way cities could address their past?
I think
it feels like this could happen many, many places.
Well, I think we don't know. I mean, is the reality. But we heard early on, back in the 90s when we had the state commission, we were getting a lot of attention. News-wise, I would get regularly contacted by a city where there maybe had been a triple lynching or something like that, and just trying to get a plaque up and the roadblocks they were running into. I think there's a lot of these that are there that have just never been discussed, and a lot of them we're probably not going to know about because by this, a lot of these go back to the 1910s and 20s and stuff like that, and the people who would have witnessed them are fading away quickly.
Okay, and Perry Wallace used to talk about. He would say reconciliation without the truth is just acting. And a lot of times institutions, families, are interested in the photo op and to show like everything's cool now, but they really haven't dealt with the truth of what got them into a situation in the first place. Right. Are there lessons to be learned from how Tulsa handled this
Well, I think so. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, there's a lot of different layers. We were actually helped most recently in the past, 10 years by, of all things, a white Republican mayor of Tulsa. Oklahoma is the reddest of the red states. It is Obama lost every single county in his elections. Trump has won every single county. Trump won Oklahoma by 35 points in the last election. But the reality is that we had a white mayor, G.T. Bynum, who grew up in a devout Catholic family, and he was very disturbed when he learned about the burial, in trenches and other places of massacre victims. And he asked me and the state archaeologists to restart the search for the mass graves, and he's been key. I think there's a couple things that are important. One is that none of us can either take credit for or blame for what our grandparents or great-grandparents did. I mean, the reality is they lived their life in their time, and we have to live ours in ours. But we do have debts as a society and institutions to right some wrongs. And, we still have one, I believe, living massacre survivor of the Tulsa Massacre. And I think we owe it to these communities. The Greenwood community, which had been destroyed, there were only 10,000 people in it, and probably just 30,000 today. It was eventually rebuilt. But there was a study done by National Geographic magazine a couple of years ago that indicated that the generational wealth loss for Greenwood was $300 million or $600 million. That's generations of house down payments, college tuition, a seed money for new businesses, all these things that were denied. So, as Faulkner once said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And we do need to address these things.
Okay, so shifting gears to sports. This is a sports and society podcast. John McClendon is at the heart of your book, The Secret Game, who has a history here in Nashville as a head coach at Tennessee State, national champion here. And I just love the story of how you came upon deciding to write about this book. And as someone that often has book ideas bouncing around my head or book projects in various stages, I was sharing with you earlier today that I'm struggling to get back writing a book I'm working on. You had a book that you were done researching or far along researching. You meet John McClendon, you completely switch gears and write a different book. Yeah,
so I'll try to tell the story briefly. So I was working at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. I was trying to think what can my second book be? What should it be about? I was comfortable writing about race. I was also a huge basketball fan because I'd gone to Duke for graduate school and caught the disease for which there is no cure, the ACC disease. So I was very much into that. And there was a saying amongst publishers, New York publishers in those days, about sports books, which was the smaller the ball, the better the book. And it was true. There was a wonderful literature of baseball, all about fathers and sons and autumn and dying and poetry and all this stuff. There was a good literature of golf and of tennis, but the books about basketball and football were not very good. And I thought, well, I can write a book about basketball. And I knew enough that I knew that the game in the 1930s was like chess matches. I mean, and in a thriller in Nashville last night, Vanderbilt nipped, Tennessee 12-11 or something like that. By the time I'm growing up in the 1960s, you got this fast-paced, acrobatic game. And I thought, well, race is going to be part of that. That's not the whole story. So I started digging into this. I realized I should write about a a Final Four, because college basketball was really the engine of change. And I did all this research on the 1957 Final Four, which featured Will Chamberlain at Kansas, at an all-white, still segregated North Carolina team, University of San Francisco, Michigan State. Civil rights movement is happening. Money's coming in. Television's coming in. And I worked on that for years. And then I made my mistake, which was to go to the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Mass, to do some research over a long weekend. And I'm up there and just bleary-eyed from looking at microfilm, and I decide to go downstairs to the auditorium, and they're having an induction of that year's class of for the Hall of Fame. And I'm just hanging out back there, and this elderly African-American gentleman sidles up to me, starts talking to me, and his name is John McClendon. I said, John McClendon, yeah, he's in the Hall of Fame, but I couldn't remember why. He's some famous guy from the early days. And then he casually mentions that he had known James Naismith, who invented basketball 100 years earlier. And I said, like, you knew James Naismith? I said, oh, that's right. You were an undergrad at KU in the 1930s, one of a handful of black students. That's where Naismith ended his career. So we exchange information. I get back to D.C. or wherever I'm living and call the sports editor of the New York Times. I say, hey, Neil, I'd like to write a story about John McClendon. He said, who the hell is John McClendon? I tell him, that's fine. I go to McClendon's home in Cleveland. We have a wonderful interview. The story will be about how difficult it was during Jim Crow days for black coaches to go on the road and to recruit and things like that. And so we're sitting at his kitchen table, and then he says, oh, wait a second, I got something to show you. And he goes to his upstairs office and comes back with this piece of paper, 3 pages typewritten. At the top, it says, Racial First in Basketball I Have Been Involved With by John B. McClendon Jr. And as you know, and some of your listeners know, McClendon was essentially the first black coach in the NBA. He was the first African-American assistant Olympic basketball coach. He was the first black coach at a predominantly white institution, first African-American coach to win a national championship, the NAIA, at Tennessee State. But at the top it says, 1944, first integrated college basketball game in the South, North Carolina College for Negroes versus Duke Navy Medical School team. And I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, well, this guy sure can't type because it sure as heck is not 1944. And I'm trying to think, when was it, 1956 or something? And I say, hey, coach, this date. And he starts talking about the game. And it was exactly at that moment that my years of work on the 1957 Final Four book was torpedoed forever to sink beneath the waves. And I had a new book to write.
Do you think you might ever resurrect it? Or
no. It's gone.
Okay, so you're writing about a secret game. Did you have any concerns that there wasn't going to be enough to find about it? How did you go about the research for that book?
I mean, when I talked to McClendon and then I got in touch with his former players, I knew I had that half. It took a long time to figure out who the Duke players were. Lots of calls, lots of research. But once I finally found a couple of them, I said, oh, this is a big story and is worthwhile. The funny thing, though, as I dove into the story and was writing about it, researching, I realized there were 2 other major stories that associated with it. One was the fact that McClendon is, if we have a Mount Rushmore of the history of basketball, he deserves to be on it. I mean, he essentially, perfects the fast break. He invents, full court pressure defense. He invents modern conditioning. He's this just gigantic figure. So was him. But the other thing I learned was that there was a forgotten generation of Southerners, primarily African-American, but some white allies as well, too, who 10 years before anyone had ever heard of Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King were waging their own war against segregation. And that was a story I had to tell as well, too. And that was a story that was part of the secret game.
Mm-hmm. It's just fascinating to me how short the degrees of connection are within the sport of basketball, where you have the inventor of basketball, James Naismith, this man that you met in the 90s or early 2000s knew, right?
Yeah.
Or you think about Naismith I think Adolph Rupp was at KU around the same time that Naismith was there, right? Who then coaches Pat Riley, who then signs LeBron James. I mean, there's about 3 or 4 degrees of separation in the history of basketball.
No, from Naismith to McClendon is just 1 degree separation, but you can go Naismith to Fog Allen to Dean Smith. I mean, and in fact, the winningest men's college basketball coach in the United States for like 80 years was a Kansas guy, and they'd either, worked with Naismith or worked with Fog Allen or were Fog Allen.
Or we're Fog Allen, right? I love the trivia that James Naismith is the only Kansas basketball coach in history with a losing record.
Losing record, exactly.
Invented the sport. All right, so you're here in Nashville to talk about your new book, Midnight on the Potomac, which is critically acclaimed, like all your books, best-selling like your books. It's a type of narrative nonfiction that I can't wait to read. Where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, it came, so the subtitle is The Last Year of the Civil War, the Lincoln Assassination, and the Rebirth of America. And the book is really about how we almost lost our country and about this remarkable coalition of people who really saved it. The book came about because of, as a nation, we have just been so divided. We've been more divided than any other time in my lifetime, and I'm old enough to remember the late 60s and early 70s. And so that attracted me to the story as well, too. But as I dug into the story and bore into it, I learned again, how close the Confederacy came to surviving, and even in the last year of the war. But the real key was when I discovered that the John Wilkes Booth that I'd been taught at Robert E. Lee Elementary School, and that you've been taught and your listeners have been taught, is all wrong. He wasn't at all this second-rate, sort of disturbed actor at all. He was this theatrical superstar. He would sell out theaters across the country. He certainly knew what he was doing, and he also had lots of contacts with the Confederate Secret Service. So once I was onto that story and I realized that our portrayal of his character was wrong, I really dug in, and and that was the genesis of the book.
Well, okay. 2 quick questions. So how close did the South come, and why is our understanding of that not correct, do you think?
Well, I think there's a few things that go on, but by the summer of 1864, in the spring of 1864, there was great optimism in the North that the loyal citizens of the North the Union was going to win the war. There was no question of it. Instead, they were mauled at both the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania. Ulysses S. Grant lost more than 35,000 troops there, nearly a third of his army. A Confederate army led by Jubal Early ended up sneaking down the Shenandoah Valley, crossed the Potomac River, and actually invaded the District of Columbia, and were within 5 hours of burning the Capitol and burning the White House. And things were so bad politically that by the end of the summer, Lincoln had been told by the Republican kingmakers there was no way in the world he would be reelected in November, and that he should withdraw. But when he refused to withdraw, he too realized it was all over and somebody else. So we came within inches because people in the North were getting very tired of the war at this point. I was raised by the World War II generation. 1 out of every 300 Americans died during World War II. For the Vietnam War, the number was 1 out of 3,500. For the Civil War, the number was 1 out of 50. So every family felt stuff, and there was a feeling in the North, let's just let them go. Let's just be done with it and divide the country. So that's how close we came.
Okay. And then on the Booth side, how did you discover new information about him that had not really been written about before?
Well, the reason for that is, thank God, the Civil War has never been the sole property of college professors. So there have always been amateurs who have entirely different professional lives, but who are so interested in an aspect of the Civil War that they spend significant portions of their lives researching it. There was a gentleman by the name of Arthur F. Lew, who worked for an insurance company in Pennsylvania, now deceased. He was a husband and a father, but on weekends in the evenings, on family vacations. He set about to collect every written mention of John Wilkes Booth anywhere. And he ended up sort of more or less, it was self-published posthumously, a book called John Wilkes Booth Day by Day, which was a chronology of Booth's life. And I ended up getting a copy, and it was amazing. It was like January 11th, 1864, Booth played Hamlet in Cleveland. January 12th, he took a train to Chicago. January 13th, he played Macbeth at the Metropolitan Theater. And I started reading all these reviews. And the version of Booth we'd been given was that, he was living in the shadow of his far more famous father and brother actors, that he was like a nothing. Booth sold out movie theaters across the country. Hundreds are turned away at the door. Scores of women would hang out at his dressing room. And the critics loved him. New York Times, New York Herald, Chicago Tribune. He's a genius, an incredible genius. It seemed as if Shakespeare had written these lines for Booth. There's not a better Booth, Henry or Richard III on either side of the Atlantic. And I realized if we've gotten his character so wrong, it's worth digging into. And then I found, other work by others who really made his ties to espionage agencies in the Confederacy.
Wow. Okay. And then I've seen an interview where you mentioned that a character in the book that really captured your attention was Lois Adams.
Yeah.
Who is she?
Lois Adams is one of the great writers of the Civil War, and hardly anybody had ever heard of her. She was a farmer's wife, a single mom in Michigan. Her husband died. She ended up being the Washington correspondent for Detroit newspapers. Moved to Washington, D.C., and thank God for librarians. There was a librarian at Central Michigan University who started collecting all of her stories and realized how great they were. She got those published. I ran into them, and she's one of the most perceptive writers on the Civil War, writes about women, writes about the contrabands, the escaped former slaves living in the city, and she just caught everything. And so, man, whenever I could use her, I used her because her stuff was so good.
Wow. Were there many women that were even writing for newspapers back then? I imagine she must have been the
she's
only
very
one.
unusual. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. You mentioned that, thank God, like the Civil War isn't just the domain of college professors. And when I think about the way that sports is studied, or if it is studied,
right.
And you teach classes that deal with sports. Sure. Has the perception of sports as a worthy academic subject changed over the course of your career? Have you ever had any battles trying to convince other faculty that it's a worthy area?
Well, I mean, I can answer that question, but I'm sort of a maverick. I've spent almost my entire career not being a college professor, so that's only been relatively recently, but I've always not written for scholars. I mean, I've always written for a general public. So, and I'm probably just too bullheaded of an Oklahoma cowboy to be concerned about what others think. So I just go ahead and do it, But I think that there's been, I mean, you would notice as well. I think there's more of a change and an interest, certainly in American studies, maybe in English, to look at sports and to study that. But, the whole, the way that history is taught has changed so much. When I'm not sure about when you were at Vanderbilt, but when I was at Reed and at Duke, you still had, narrative history courses taught, the history of the British Empire or something like that. A lot of those courses are gone now, and it's more about agency or the role of women or just different ways of peeking in and poking at history.
Mm-hmm. I think I have seen, when I wrote my paper about Perry, I was concerned that I would be told we don't write about basketball players in college. Like this is a Black history course. That's not significant enough. I was grateful that my professor, Dr. Jones, said, go for it if that's what you're interested in. Now we have a sports and society minor here at Vanderbilt, in addition to the initiative. And I think that this is seeing this more and more across the country. All right, so back to your current book. You talked about similarities in some ways, a country divided like never before. Like 600,000 people killed during the Civil War, or more than that. I mean, is this a book that you feel like we can draw lessons from today? Or is it going to take another million people dying?
No. I think we can draw a lot of lessons from it. Again, one thing that just impressed me so greatly was just the sacrifice that loyal citizens made to preserve the nation. And in the book, readers are going to read about the familiar, important figures: Lincoln, Lee, Grant, Jefferson Davis, Sherman, things like that. But what really saved the United States and kept us together as a country was an unprecedented, remarkable coalition of loyal citizens, men and women, black and white, free and unfree, native-born and immigrant, who were able to tamp down some of their own particular interests, work together, form a coalition, and they were able to defeat the Confederacy. They were able to destroy slavery. Do you know that 1 out of every 7 Americans went from unfree to free during the Civil War? They're able to preserve the Union, but they also gave our country a new chance to do a better job of living up to our founding principles. So this is a generation that I think is so crucial in our history. We stand on all of their shoulders today. The America we've all grown up in is in part due to them. But I also wanted to remind us of the heroes in our past. We live in a cynical age, and people are sick of politics, they're sick of political parties, things like that. But I have 23-year-old children, and their generation feels very battered. And the reality is there are lots of Americans, despite all the bad things in our history, there is so much light in our history and so much positivity as well. We have these incredible heroes and heroines in the past who have done so much to win us our rights, protect our freedoms. And I wanted to remind readers of that and to take strength and courage from that, because our institutions, our traditions are under attack right now, and we need to defend them.
Well, I can't wait to read this book.
Good.
If people are interested in learning more or following you, how can they do it?
Well, I'm easy to find. My name is Scott Ellsworth. I teach at the University of Michigan. I do finally have a website up, scottellsworthauthor.com. And if any of your readers out there, listeners, have any idea for my next book, I would love to hear them, because I'm struggling with that.
But you're not going back to the 57 Final Four.
No, I'm not. It's not happening.
Maybe a history of the Charles Chip, or
I don't think so.
memoir on those.
We'll work it out.
All right. Well,
other people can make their suggestions.
Okay, I'll stop with mine. All right, Scott. Well, thank you for joining
Thanks,
the show,
Andrew.
and welcome back to Nashville.
Thanks. It's great to be here.